Hello everyone and welcome to BriscoeGames. So today is going to be our first entry in a new series that I'm going to be doing pretty consistently called WTF, also known as What the Freak, because we are a kids friendly channel here, so we would definitely make sure that we always edit ourselves in the most beautiful and luxurious way possible. But WTF, and what this pretty much is going to be pretty much rundown of why things are the way they are. And in this episode we're going to be talking about the PlayStation 5 and Series X. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the PlayStation 5 and Series X have released, aka the X Bros for the Xbox Series X and S, aka the base station for the beautiful PlayStation 5. So with that, there's been a bunch of comparison videos coming out showing different performances of games, so you can see what game is performing like what on what platform. And surprisingly, for a lot of people, I would say the PlayStation 5 versions of games have generally been the better performing version, even though technically speaking on paper the Xbox Series X should be the more powerful console. So WTF, what the freak is going on here? Well, that's what this channel is for. Not really. That's what this topic is about, and that's what this segment is about. And so we're gonna dive into that, and I'm gonna give you my insight into it, as well as some of my developer friends that I've also talked to as well, because word spreads around the community. It is what it is. We talk, we have different things like that, and unlike them, I'm not under NDA. I don't work directly with Sony. I don't work directly with Microsoft, so I can run my big mouth in this case all day on this topic. And it's actually kind of interesting once you really dive down into what's going on, because I guess there's no real specs put out for PlayStation that gives finite hardware on what exactly they have in there and what they're doing, whereas Microsoft has been a bit more open because they thought initially on paper and in their minds that there was no way they were going to lose this battle. And there's a reason why it's happening, and it's not just because of tools or whatever people want you to believe. That's not it. There's other reasons why as well too, and I'm here to give you that. So without further ado, make sure you click that like and subscribe button. Subscribe, because we are going to be doing our PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X giveaway on Friday, aka December 25th, aka Christmas Day. So make sure you are subscribed for that, and without further ado, here we go. Now, first and foremost, let me start by saying this is not a bash Xbox video at all, so please let's not take it as such, and let's not be in the comments doing that. Again, this channel is all about positivity, but it's also about the truth, and the truth of the matter is there are some issues going on the Xbox side that is causing this, as well as there are some benefits and positive things going on the PlayStation side that are also causing this dynamic where both platforms are performing neck and neck, with the PlayStation more often than not coming out in advance, coming out ahead of the Xbox. And that's what this video is going to be about. What's going on with the system, with the Xbox side, what benefits is the PlayStation receiving, and what Microsoft can do to kind of fix this. So based on what I was able to do in my own experiments, the knowledge that I have in the tech community, as well as other tech community enthusiasts who also gave me their feedback, as well as people, once again, who work closely with these systems, since I'm more so on the PC and mobile side, there's four main reasons as to why the PlayStation 5 is performing better than the Xbox Series X currently. And the first reason is because the Xbox Series X, the toolkits and the dev kits are behind the PlayStation 5s. Now I know you're already thinking like, didn't you just say that was gonna be one of the reasons? Well, yes, that is one of the reasons. It is one of the reasons, and it's a legit reason why this is going on, but that's not the only thing, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. The second reason, the hardware. So the GPU clocks on the Series X versus the PlayStation 5 is having a bigger performance difference than Microsoft actually anticipated, and possibly to an extent slightly Sony anticipated as well too. Even though Mark Cerny was very upfront about all the benefits that it has of having a higher clock GPU, we're definitely seeing it show its performance gains significantly more, I would say, in a console than it is traditionally on a PC. And yeah, the hardware is another one. Number three, The PlayStation 5's hardware customizations offer better performance in-game than what the Xbox Series X hardware customizations are offering. The PlayStation 5, plain and simple, has more customizations going on inside of the console as far as gaming dedicated customizations, and those customizations are paying off for them tenfold over what Microsoft is doing. And last but not least, the Xbox Series X API is another problem that just going on with the console. So that is probably going to be the biggest issue that's going on right now, to be completely honest, is the API in the Xbox Series X in comparison to the PlayStation 5. But I'll say that when I get to that topic, because it is going to be a deep dive into that, and you definitely don't want to miss anything on that. But here we go, we're going to dive into this, starting with number 1. So, it's been stated that the development tools of the Xbox Series X, known as GDK, and the console itself have been a part of the reason why the Series X isn't performing above the PlayStation 5. According to Microsoft, the Xbox Series X console and tools were in devs' hands at least months after Sony's. And realistically, if we look at the leaks that were going on with the PlayStation 5 dev kits that were out and about, it was at least nearly half a year. So logically speaking, if you have, let's say, around 6 months to optimize and code on one platform versus the other, obviously the one you have the additional 6 months is going to give you a little bit more performance, just because you have more time with it, more hands-on with it. So to an extent, what they're saying has some truth to it, but it's not the only thing. And that's one of the things that need to be highly advertised, as this is only part of the problem as far as the overall tools and dev kit scenario goes. I don't want to say excuse, let's just say scenario. So the reason why is because there are developers who have publicly stated that they had no problems with the tools on the Xbox and that things were up and running just fine. However, their games, for some of them, are still performing a bit better on PlayStation. So it's not the only issue, and the only thing it can be boiled down to is exactly what Mark Cerny said during his keynote for the PlayStation 5. During the keynote, he discusses the importance of evolution and revolution, and how they worked on ensuring that they were able to balance keeping things simple and familiar for developers, while also adding additional things, giving more and providing more benefits for developers to learn the new technologies to help create their games for the new platforms. And that kind of ideology is one that's usually used for game engines. So it's taking an engine, you have everything that already works. So what you have there, you just fine tune it and redefine everything that's going on in there. So it's more simplified and those processes are easier for you. And then when you're starting to add new features and things into the game engine, it helps allow you to do more things that you weren't able to do with the previous version of that. So Sony and Mark Cerny took a more game engine type approach to their tools. So with Microsoft starting with GDK, they basically started completely over to an extent. I won't say completely over because obviously some things still transfer, but with Sony, they had 7 years of foundations based on the PlayStation 4 tools that all they were doing was just fine-tuning, making even better, and then adding additional things for PlayStation 5 benefits as well too. So developers just have significantly more experience with the base end of the PlayStation 5 tools, whereas on the Series X console, they don't really have nearly as much experience because not everything is exactly like it was for the Xbox One. And here and there, that is the problem for the Xbox Series consoles, because their tools are not just dedicated towards the Xbox Series consoles. Their tools have to work on the original Xbox One, the VCR edition, the Xbox One S, the Xbox One X, the Xbox Series S, the Xbox Series X, and PC. So their tools are meant to run a gambit of different hardware, whereas the PlayStation tools are based on the foundation of the PlayStation 4. So PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro, they're already golden with those tools. And then you have the PlayStation 5, which is only one console. Even though there's two versions, they're still the same hardware. So basically, it's if your game can run on the base consoles, You can move it over to the PlayStation 5, up the resolution, up the performance, add additional features and code and optimize towards that, and you're golden. Whereas Microsoft, while they're still trying to do that, the thing is they have over 6 different hardware variations that they're looking at for their games, and it's one of the reasons why developers are having a little bit more of an issue making sure their games are optimized for Xbox in comparison to the PlayStation 5. So the next thing is the hardware, or more specifically the clock speeds on the consoles. So with the CPU side of things, there's differences there, but it's not enough to really be the major point of discussion over here. There's the rumor of it being RDNA 2.5 for the PlayStation 5 versus, excuse me, not RDNA 2.5, it being Zen 2.5 in comparison to Zen 2 for the Xbox Series S, but that's neither here nor there. And just based on a few tests that I did myself and a few tests that you can actually try on your own, you can kind of see where the performance curve is about the same for both platforms, especially when you look at it in comparison to Zen 2. So I don't think that's the case, but who knows, we'll see if there's some magical little thing that comes out in the future. But the main difference would be the GPUs. And what we're gonna do is use an RX 6800, for example, for this situation, just because it's the only GPU really out from AMD that is somewhat in comparison to the PlayStation 5 and the Series X. It has more CUs, so it has about 60 cores in comparison to those, which only have 36 for the PlayStation 5 and 52 for the Series X. But it's just a good foundation, a good constant to do this experiment. So the base clock of the RX 6800 XT is 1.815 gigahertz. And the boost clock is 2.1 gigahertz, a little higher, but you can overclock it. So we're gonna overclock it to about 2.25 gigahertz just for this comparison's sake and to make things easier. You'll understand why in just a bit. So looking at the base clocks and boost clocks of that GPU, you basically get, once again, 1.815 and 2.25 for the base clock and the boost clock. And if you look at that in comparison to the Series X and PlayStation 5 GPU, you start to see they look extremely familiar, because the Series X GPU is clocked at 1.825 gigahertz, which is only 10 megahertz higher than a base clock for the RDNA GPUs. And the PlayStation 5 is clocked at 2.23 gigahertz, which is about 20 megahertz lower than their boost clocks. So you can kind of see where they were aiming for these consoles to be at. Microsoft decided to have their console locked at a steady base clock, whereas the PlayStation 5, they allowed the console to move up and down to a boost clock. And for the vast majority of the console's runtime, it is hitting that boost clock. So you have 1.825 gigaflops, 1.825 gigahertz compared to 2.23 gigahertz, and it's actually doing a lot more for these consoles than most people would have thought to have that big of a gap. So once again, going back to the RX 6800, it's a 60 CU GPU. So what we're gonna do is take the base clock of the Xbox Series X and the boost clock, or in this case the performance clock of the PlayStation 5, and tie it to that GPU. So if you have a 60 CU GPU at 1.825 gigahertz, basically you end up with a 14 teraflop GPU. If you take that same 60 CU GPU, exact same thing, change nothing except for the clock speeds to match the PlayStation 5's 2.23 gigahertz, you end up with a 17.1 teraflop GPU. So that's a whole 3.1 teraflops difference from only changing the clock speed. So right then and there, you can see just how much of a theoretical performance gain you get from just changing the clock speeds. So that's a pretty huge jump. And it ends up being a jump of about 22.1% increase in comparison to, between the two GPUs. And so you would expect to see a good 22.1 increase in your game performance, but the reality is you don't. you often see something around only 10%, and that's because GPU scaling isn't one-to-one. So this is one of the reasons why using teraflops is a horrible comparison, because I won't say it's a horrible comparison. If it's a exact like for like hardware, then it's a decent comparison to try to find performance differences. But if there's any kind of difference whatsoever in architecture between the two that you're comparing, then teraflops almost means nothing. It's like a number, you can just throw any number out there at that point. There's a formula for getting it, but you can just throw any number out there at that point, because it's not a one-to-one scaling, and without being one-to-one, you're not going to get the appropriate values that you're looking for. So now that we completely destroyed the teraflop marketing push that's probably on everyone's minds, or has been on everyone's mind prior to the reveal of these consoles, we can get on to what really matters. But once again, GPU scaling isn't one-to-one. However, it is significantly closer to being one-to-one when you're going by two things that matter: the CUs in the GPU and the clock speed of the GPU. So getting back to using the RX 6800 as our constant in this experiment, we're going to do a little bit of an example that's going to show exactly what's going on here. So the RX 6800 once again has 60 CUs, meanwhile the Xbox Series X has 52 CUs and the PlayStation 5 has 36 CUs. So then and there's a fairly noticeable difference in the amount of CUs that each GPU has. So if we take the Series X base clock of 1.825 gigahertz and we apply that to all the GPUs, then the 6800, if that's the 100% target for our constant, then the Xbox Series X is about 86.67% of that performance offered by the 6800 at that clock speed, and the PlayStation 5 is all the way down at 60% of the performance of the RX 6800 if we use those same clock speeds across both GPUs based on the CUs that those GPUs have individually. So that would pretty much put the Series X on par with the RTX 2080 Super, and it will put the PlayStation 5 on paper with that clock speed. Again, this isn't the PlayStation 5's actual clock speed, it's with the Series X clock speed. It will put it on par with the RTX 2060 Super, which is a fairly noticeable difference. Yeah. But thanks to Digital Foundry, we know that the PlayStation 5 is performing pretty much on par with the RTX 2080 in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, thanks to my British brothers across the pond. Oh, that was kind of horrible. That was a horrible little British accent. Yeah, I don't like that. We'll go ahead and keep that though. We'll keep that there for. But yeah, this PlayStation 5 is actually performing closer to a RTX 2080, and not only is it performing closer to a RX 2080, it's also outperforming the Xbox Series X by hitting a minimum resolution of 1440p compared to the Xbox Series X 1080p. So what does that mean? Is the PlayStation 5 just punching far above its weight, or what's going on there? And the answer part of the answer is the clock speeds. So if we take that same experiment and keep the RX 6800 at the same clock speeds of the Xbox Series X, and keep the Xbox Series X at its same clock speed, but we give the PlayStation 5 its clock speed back. I know I said clock speed 3 times. Something about to happen. I'm about to start spinning around at 2.23 gigahertz. But if we give those speeds back to the PlayStation 5 by keeping everyone else at the same speed they were at, then we get the same situation where the Xbox Series X is once again at 86.67% of the performance of the RX 6800, and the PlayStation 5 is now 73.02% of that performance, which puts it significantly closer to an RTX 2070 Super, which is a lot closer in comparison to where the PlayStation 5 is actually landing. Meanwhile, the Xbox Series X is actually performing less than where it theoretically should be performing at. The third reason why this is going on is due to customizations, or more so a bit lack thereof on the Xbox side. So Both consoles use AMD's Zen processors, Zen 2 processors, and RDNA 2.0. An extent of how much they use it varies per console, but you don't need all the features of RDNA 2.0 to be comparable or a highly performing GPU. Some features are just little things here, little softwares here that won't really have any impact on games. So the whole touting of we have full RDNA 2.0 is nothing but pure marketing at that point. So the differences that we have here are the RAM, which the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 both have 16 gigs of GDDR6 RAM. However, the Xbox Series X has a 10 gig and a 6 gig pool, where the 10 gig is at 560 gigabits per second and the 6 gig is at 335 gigabits per second of GDDR6. And the PlayStation 5 is a unified pool, full 16 gigs at 448 gigabytes per second. So basically with that, usually speaking, having two pools split is usually a bad thing for GPUs, because there comes a point where you just don't have the full amount that you need, and the dual bandwidths of the RAMs can cause performance issues in games. That being said, it only happens when you exceed that limit. So for games that are exceeding the 10 gig limit, then yes, it's gonna have little performance hiccups here and there. They're never really detrimental to the point where like tanks performance or anything like that. It's just that in certain scenes that are more memory intensive, you'll start to notice those issues on the Xbox Series X due to hitting that 10 gig high bandwidth speed max and having to result to the lower bandwidth 6 gigs of RAM to try to help make up for that. Whereas on the PlayStation, it's a full 448 gigabits per second across the board, so they don't have those issues if they go over that 10 gig limit. It's just going to continue to flow consistently because the memory is unified. Next, the SSD, which is, as everyone knows, a high selling point for the PlayStation 5. It's one of their key talking points. And the reason why this is such a big talking point is because the speed of their SSD, along with their compression or their decompression engine, is significantly faster than just about anything that we've had so far. Definitely more than anything we ever had on console, but even so on PC to an extent. And the reason why is because it's not being used as just regular memory. The theory behind it and the intention behind it is that they want to use a portion of the SSD to basically be a large pool of DDR3 level memory. So it basically gives games, let's say they put 20 gigs of data apart on your SSD just for games. It basically gives you the 16 gigs for the system of GDDR6, but now you also have this potential 20 gig pool of DDR3 level speed because of the SSD. So it basically just gives you this large pool of RAM to continuously have your games loading and load things in when you need them in that moment. That was me snapping. I forgot I'm on I forgot I'm recording. I'm over snapping, trying to enunciate with what I'm saying. But basically that's what they're trying to do. Long story short, they're trying to take their SSD and make it a giant pool of RAM. And with the speeds they have with their decompression engine cracking, they're able to reach up to 22 gigabits per second with full I/O, which is pretty much the same speed that the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 had as far as their system memory. So basically you have this large pool of memory that they are trying to use to start revolutionizing how game development is. On the Series X, they have a decompression engine as well. We know their SSD is about 2.4 gigabits per second compressed, 4.8 gigabits per second uncompressed, in comparison to the PlayStation 5, 5.5 gigs compressed and around 9 gigs uncompressed. But using their decompression engine, so far from what I've been told, it looks like they're only able to get around 12 gigabits per second full I/O compared to 22 gigs on the PlayStation. So when you have what is essentially nearly twice the speed, a little bit less than twice the speed, it's definitely going to start making a difference but that's going to be more for exclusives than it is for multi-plat. So in the here and now, you only see like the PlayStation winning in like load times for next gen games here and there for the most part, but eventually that's going to become a big win for them on their exclusives. The next thing, the Xbox Series X has a standard SSD controller, whereas the PlayStation 5 has a custom SSD controller. It also has dedicated DMA controller with 2 I/O co-processors. It has a 512 megabyte DDR4 cache for RAM for the SSD as well too. So it just has a bunch of different customizations like that in the system, that from what we know of the Xbox Series X, it has more of a standardized set of features versus these custom features that help benefit the PlayStation 5. They're not features that just drastically change performance, but each one of them individually is contributing to this system pushing above its weight. And the last one is the highly customized geometry engine. Now, we hear geometry engine, and Mark Cerny went over this as well too, but a geometry engine is established in plenty of GPUs now, so it's nothing new. It's not new terminology. Even the Xbox Series X has geometry engine as well too, because it's in AMD's GPUs. However, Sony has highly customized theirs to take maximum advantage of their console, and it's just one of those things where it just does it for you, and so you don't have to spend time coding or developing as hard on certain features, because the geometry engine with its performance, it basically frees up memory and compute, which helps overall performance. So the more memory and the more compute you have freed up, the more performance you have to build your games upon. And the geometry engine basically just takes care of some tasks that the developers would previously have to get coded, such as like their VRS or mesh shaders. The geometry engine takes care of that, plus other things as well too. So it basically frees tools up for the developers and frees system performance up, since it's such a high customized part of the PlayStation 5 and sits on top of the GPU. It just helps overall performance drastically, whereas the Xbox Series X has a more traditional geometry engine, so it does VRS as well too, and D3D mesh shaders as well, but the customizations of the PlayStation 5 just outperform what the Series X geometry engine is capable of. And last but not least, the other issue that is going on with the Xbox Series X is the API. So the Xbox consoles, by comparison to the PlayStation consoles, are more PC-like. They have basically a PC API with Xbox tweaks here and there. And based on what I know, this is one of the reasons why the Series X versions of games early on aren't performing as well as you'd expect. With consoles, you generally have low-level access to your hardware, so there's this saying of coding to the metal, where you can basically code to the lowest denominator of the console, so you can make sure things are optimized and running at max performance in certain areas. Well, the Xbox Series X has an API, but it's more traditional like PC than it is like a console. So having that, it kind of doesn't allow the Xbox Series X to push above its weight as much as the PlayStation 4, as much as the PlayStation 5 is doing. So that's something that's definitely going to hold them back unless they get that part fixed. The good thing about this is that features work across all the Xbox platforms to an extent, and to an extent they work across PC as well without having to change much. So as you can see, games are easily patched and take advantage of the more powerful hardware. For example, like Cyberpunk 2077, we'll get to that in another video as well too, about the mess that's going on with that. But on Series X, you have more crowd density, and on games like Call of Duty Warzone, there's 120 frames per second mode that came to Series X just because the instruction set can be rewritten. Now, the bad thing about this is that it's unlikely that Microsoft will ever be able to get the API to be at the low-level access they need to be on par with what Sony has with the PlayStation 5. So to fix this, what they would basically have to do is drop support from the older consoles and customize the API and customize the tools significantly more towards Xbox, which will lose some PC compatibility, which is one of the things that they're trying not to do. So I don't think we'll ever get to a point where the API is able to go head to head with what Sony has with the PlayStation 5. And there you have it. That is pretty much what's going on with the Xbox Series X right now. And the reality of the situation is some of these things can be changed, but I don't think Microsoft necessarily wants to change them for the better. I think they're happy with what they have with their system, and they expected just having flat out a more powerful GPU that it would be enough to make up for it. But I guess they're starting to see that the benefits that having a customized console can have can actually cause dramatic performance gains, because by all means the PlayStation 5 should be on par with the 2070 or 2070 Super, but thanks to the little customizations, it's pushing closer to a 2080, and as the tools grow, we'll see it probably get closer to the 2080 Super, and maybe even up to a 2080 Ti in performance in exclusives. So the Xbox took a more of a jack of all trades, master of none kind of route, and it's gonna be good for them as far as being able to have their games across multiple platforms, but they're just gonna have a harder time keeping pace, especially in exclusives, I would say, with what Sony is intending to do with the PlayStation 5 and its SSD. Now, that's not to say that the Series X tools won't get better over time, because they absolutely will, but so will the PlayStation 5s. But there is one area where the Xbox Series X does have a raw win that can't really be overcome, and that's in ray tracing, simply because it's hardware ray tracing is always tied to the CUs, to the ray tracing cores, and the Series X simply just has more ray tracing cores with its 52 CUs than the PlayStation 5 has. So that's one area that they'll always be able to have a little bit of an advantage in, that we'll probably only see with exclusives. And yeah, it's not gonna be like a huge difference. It'll definitely have some, they might have some features where they can have their, let's say, ray tracing at a 1440p output, where PlayStation is still gonna stay with the 1080p output for theirs, but it's not gonna be anything where it's gonna be drastically different. And that's just gonna be in most games as well too. A lot of games, the vast majority of games for that matter, are usually, you know, smaller games or digital games, indie games and things like that, or things from like A-tier developers. I don't want to say that, that's kind of disrespectful, let me take that back. Things from developers who aren't pushing that $50 to $100 million budget. So those big budget titles, those are going to be the ones that really push these consoles. Whereas for the rest of us, myself included, if we did develop for those systems, it's gonna pretty much be parity across the board, because our games will be able to run 4K 60, 4K 120 pretty much without issue on this hardware for most of us. And that's just kind of where it's gonna end up at. Like, most games are gonna be the same on both platforms regardless. You might see a few things here or there where you see the PlayStation might have a little bit better performance and rasterization just because of the geometry engine. The SSD, people start learning how to use that as a pool of RAM, and just other little features here and there like that from the customizations. Or you might see the Xbox Series X have a little bit better ray tracing performance in comparison to the PlayStation 5 because of the more CUs it has. So it's overall going to be fairly comparable. Like always, you'll see the biggest difference probably in exclusives, and we'll really see what Microsoft does with their new developers and the exclusives that they should be having come to their console and a PC as well too. We'll see what they really do and how far they push with the Bethesda acquisition plus all their other studios, and see if those games actually come out and actually maximize the hardware that they're working on. Because we know for a fact that PlayStation's developers, they're going to do it regardless. They've done it every single generation, and they're going to continue to do it. But other than that, that is it for this video. Once again, this is not an Xbox bash video, so please don't be in the comments going in on Xbox or talking bad about it, because Xbox is still a great console. What they put out was a great console, even though it is significantly more PC-like than people would probably want it to be, it's still a great console. And I absolutely think the Xbox Series X itself is a great console, and it's going to be a good platform overall. They have the studios this time around, so we won't, hopefully, let me say that, hopefully we won't have the drought of games that the Xbox One X kind of have from an exclusive standpoint. And yeah, it's gonna be a good console. It's gonna be a great time to be a gamer no matter what platform you're on. So once again, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to subscribe because we will have our giveaway coming up on Friday for Christmas. That's going to be giving away one Xbox Series X and one PlayStation 5 as well too, as well as many other prizes as well too. So don't just come just for those things, because there's other things you can win as well too. But this is BriscoeGames signing off. Have a wonderful day. Once again, stay up, stay blessed, and stay positive. Peace. X, just because the instruction set can be rewritten